Well, good evening, my theosophy buddies. It's good to see you all again, at least in my mind's eye. It's fun to say hello from the Sierra foothills. It's a beautiful day up here today. It's a pleasure to be able to have a chance to talk with you again. So, what I want to do tonight is to spend a little while talking about some new developments in quantum mechanics, cosmology, one bit of experimental news that has bearing eventually, I hope, on our studies in consciousness, which is an ongoing point of interest for us. Um, what I would like to start off with first, though, is continuation of a little bit of a public service announcement that I began last time that I was with you folks. Um, I had spent a minute um, talking about the emerging news of concern regarding microplastics and their ubiquity in the environment and the ubiquity with which we're finding little micro, or actually even more commonly nanoscopic pieces of particles, plastics in various organ tissues, including our brains. Well, I mentioned at the time that it might be a little bit of a tip of iceberg type situation. And keeping an eye on it, I'm realizing now, wow, it's going to take us a while to sketch out this iceberg. It's big. Uh, I'm going to try not to be alarmist about it because it's not really helpful. I just want to sketch out what we're learning about the size of this iceberg right now. And so there's been some pieces of news come out about it that I've paid attention to. Last time I mentioned that there had been a study done showing within a group of typical Western adult humans, there could be as much as 7 grams of little nanoscopic pieces of plastic that had made it past the blood-brain barrier and were lodged in people's brains. Well, that's looking to be maybe a little bit to the low side. And it depends on how old the individuals involved are and how long they've been living in a heavily plastics polluted environment. Now that turns out to be quite variable from place to place. There are many sources of these plastics. Some people have more, some people have less. It's a thing. And now there's beginning to be data accumulating in terms of how these embedded microplastics in organisms' brains affect their behavior. There's been studies that I've been made aware of now in hermit crabs, insects, and mice, where they've been able to study how much plastic is in this animal's brain and how does it behave. And what they can do is there's various experimental paradigms for assessing how with it a hermit crab is, and it has to do with giving them choices between making either adaptive or maladaptive decisions about which shell to try to live in, for example. The hermit crabs have evolved over hundreds of millions of years, and they know how to judge a shell as to whether they should move into it or not. Bees, there's ways that you can test the cognitive fitness of bees. And with mice, there's ways to test. Well, okay, so here's the slightly disturbing news, is that if you load these animals up with significant amount of microplastics, they start making bad decisions, maladaptive decisions, decisions that don't quite make sense. They aren't quite as survival savvy in the way they're navigating their world. Um, I I don't have the data regarding were these loads high or far beyond what humans are currently experiencing or typical. I don't have those numbers, but there at least does seem to be a relationship between a load of these particles and decision making capacity. Okay, Let's take a look around the world right now. Um, a curious scientist might ask, do we have any large-scale evidence of populations of, say, humans making notably poor decisions lately in, say, the last year? One might argue yes. I can't say that's down to microplastics, but it's certainly a question worth thinking about. What's the culprit at a sort of a toxicological level? It seems to be inflammation. And that's not too surprising because anytime you put chemicals that aren't supposed to be someplace, even if they're chemically inert and aren't doing anything bad at a molecular level, just physically being there, they can cause inflammation. And so inflammation seems to be at the root of the problems being seen. There's been one study I'm aware of now that showed that you could take mice who were acting funny because they had enough microplastics dosed into their brains, and you could reverse that behavior by giving them certain amounts of vitamin E. That's an interesting finding because vitamin E can have anti-inflammatory properties with the right organism under the right circumstances. Um, it's I want to make sure to point out that that's not a reason to go out and start taking a bunch of vitamin E. We used to think that was a great thing to do 20 years ago. Antioxidant. Anything that's an antioxidant, it's good for you. It's going to downregulate inflammation and make you healthier, happier, live longer, be smarter. It's not that simple. Since then, we've learned a lot more about antioxidants. Vitamin E in large amounts is probably not good for most people. In fact, there's been experimental demonstration of harm. Mice aren't humans. That which is good for mice, like pretty much any antioxidant you pull off the shelf is going to be good for mice. Doesn't work that way for humans because our metabolism is much slower, our systems are more complicated. It's different. You don't get to do an exact correspondence between what's good for the mouse and what's good for the human. So I'm encouraging you to tune your ear to this. We'll be talking about it again. You'll be hearing more about it, sometimes in more knowing ways than others, and I'll be here to try to point out which along the way. I do want to come back to something that I began talking with you about years ago. In fact, in one of the very first talks I had here by online from the hills, I did one of these sort of public service announcement things, and I spent a while talking to you about the growing evidence for health benefits coming from a molecule called sulforaphane, which is the chief active ingredient in broccoli and the Brassica family of vegetables that seem to be so good for people. So there's a molecule, sulforaphane. You might recognize this. You saw this from me before on May 30th of 2021. I'm sure you all remember that. Sulforaphane downregulates inflammation and has now been clinically shown to be good for lots of conditions, and GRAS, generally recognized as safe. We certainly know that eating lots of broccoli and cauliflower is okay. And nobody seems to be hurt by that. I'm not at the point where I want to say go out and start taking sulforaphane supplements for a number of reasons. One of them being there's plenty of people selling sulforaphane supplements now that it's become fashionable that don't have the right thing in the bottle. You would have to research that a lot. But more importantly, any supplement one takes has the potential to bump you up to an unnaturally high blood level of that molecule, and weird things can happen. There can be unwanted side effects. There can very easily be collisions between this supplement one is taking and other medications that a person might be on. So we need to be humble and judicious and careful about the whole topic of supplementation. And you really would, if you would want to talk this over with your doctor, you would want your doctor to know every single supplement you take so that he or she would have judgment as to whether there's going to be a collision with something peculiar to you, your physiology, your medical history, or the meds you're on. This is a place where the more data we've collected, the more we've learned to be careful. Uh, and so be careful about this. Learn about it, read about sulforaphane, maybe have a talk with your doctor, think about it, but pounding broccoli is probably not a bad idea because it does decrease brain inflammation to some extent. It has been measured and is known about. Okay, moving on, and I'll put a pin in that. I'll come back with more data as it comes along. So what I'm going to do now is just get to a couple little news items and give some quick descriptions of them, because it's just kind of fun. I enjoy doing that. It's intellectually quite a bit easier than drawing lots of diagrams and talking about wave functions and double slit experiments and quantum mechanics. So here's from the May 17th issue of my favorite New Scientist magazines. Biophotons. We, meaning all living organisms, emit a ghostly glow that goes away when we die. This is actually old news. I can remember having attended a conference about 15-ish years ago where I went to a poster session and had a lovely long chat with a woman who was studying this bioluminescence or biophotonic glow that comes off of living tissues using a very specialized apparatus in her lab that at the time was pushing the very limits of what we call photomultiplier tube technology. So one way of reading electromagnetic radiation, which includes visible light, and turning that into a signal that you can use to study light coming off of something, is to use a photomultiplier tube, which essentially is a very highly technically evolved version of an apparatus I described to you now several times that was used at the turn of the century, the 19th to 20th century, in discovering something called the photoelectric effect, which is that if you shine light onto a piece of metal that is held at negative bias relative to ground, you'll knock electrons loose from that piece of metal, and those electrons will fly through space, and you can end up reading that as a measurable current. Well, that act multiplied by a few million times using very clever electronics results in something called a photomultiplier tube, which can be made sensitive enough to read down at the single photon level. Now, it's a big device. You can't make these things very small. It looks kind of like a vacuum tube from the back of an old TV set. So she was studying with very low resolution just whether there's any light coming off of tissues or not, and with the sense that this would one day be turned into an important technology. Well, that day has come, because now we have just learned, as evidenced in this article, this is coming out of the lab of a fellow named Dan Oblak at the University of Calgary in Canada. Dan is now using more modern, high-density detector matrices. Think like a CCD camera, but far more sophisticated and sensitive. So now we can record square pixelated images of this biophotonic energy coming off of organisms and make pictures. None of the stuff I'm getting has published pictures of that yet, but I'll try to come up with that next time we meet, because by then I'll probably have pictures. But What's so interesting about this is that now this coming into range of stable and relatively robust semiconductor type technology in the sensors means that we're going to be able to start taking pictures. Now these pictures are based on a few photons per second per centimeter of area. That's how dim it is. So apart from the highly sensitive detectors, he had to go to great lengths in order to filter out any kind of extraneous light and filter against any infrared light that is just spontaneously being emitted as black body radiation from warm tissue. And already some interesting things are coming from it. It's still a little bit speculative as to the chemical origin of these biophotons. It's thought to probably arise from the reactive oxygen species, ROS, that are prevalent at relatively high concentration in the cellular organelles we call mitochondria in the cells. The spectrum of this light is, I don't think, is fully understood yet. In other words, can we measure exact wavelengths and lumps and bumps in its spectrum in order to infer things about what's going on? Um, One of the interesting things that was pointed out here that kind of grabbed my attention was that it's really all living tissue. Now, let's hope someday this technology grows and we're going to be able to use it to peer into the brain and see what's going on there using visible light. But we're quite far from that now. This is in early days. It's, can we see a signal or not, and what makes it stronger or dimmer? One of the things that's been discovered that makes it stronger is if tissue is put into a state of stress, and this applies even to tree leaves. So there's a tree called an umbrella tree that they've done experiments with here in this study, where they can take a leaf off and you can see that, yeah, okay, this tree leaf, freshly picked, putting off some amount of light. Furthermore, that if they cut that leaf, it lights up at points of injury, indicating probably the heightened chemical activity that we know kicks in from other means at injury sites when a piece of living tissue is trying to repair itself or address some kind of an insult to its homeostasis. There will be a burst of chemical activity and enzymes released. They could even take a leaf from this tree and see extra light coming off of it if they put benzocaine, which is a local anesthetic, onto this leaf tissue. Meaning that even though tree leaves don't have nerves as we know it, um, if you make the leaf think that it's been injured by putting a numbing agent on there, it upregulates its metabolism. It's trying to repair whatever's wrong. Something's out of homeostasis here where we put this benzocaine, which would be an anesthetic to us. The tree doesn't like it. The tree thinks there's something wrong if you put benzocaine on a leaf. And more of this light starts coming off. I found that quite fascinating. I will look forward to hearing the origins of that, why it's happening. Um, Extrapolating this, the reason it's sort of so astounding if you think about where it could go, if we can ever develop this to the point of being able to see inside living tissue a significant distance, we might be able to come up with a technology that allows us to image neuronal processing in brain tissue with better both spatial and temporal fidelity or resolution than what we have now. So most of you who pay attention to scientific topics and or studies in consciousness, you're familiar with fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, where they'll show how if people think about a certain thing, mathematical problems, or if they're viewing images or something, put them in an MRI scanner, you can see parts of the brain lighting up in different ways to correlate with the kind of stimuli they are receiving or the kinds of mental exercises they're doing. And this is a very useful tool in consciousness research and in neurology in terms of medical clinical work. But it's sort of a blunt instrument. The fMRI imaging tends to be based, most of the stuff you see tends to be based on something called the blood oxygen level signal, the so-called bold signal. And it's really just a sign of metabolism. And the spatial resolution is not very good. The best you can pin down where this thing is happening is to a few cubic millimeters. And that's in a really good instrument. And there's a time lag. In other words, sometimes it's reporting quite late. It's reporting on what happened in that tissue a few seconds ago. So it's not an instantaneous reporter. So as much as we have learned about the neural correlates of consciousness using fMRI, it's still kind of crude and low resolution. So a new technology like this, just even the distant promise of it, is quite exciting. Okay, I'll go on from there. I am not going to go substantially over time the way I did last time, so I want to try and march through these topics with relative dispatch. So the next thing I was going to bring up is a new suggestion in the science of quantum mechanics that is arriving with us now, both from theoretical and experimental studies that are just taking place. First one is from January 11th of 2025, and it's a whole long article called Bursting the Bubble. Let's see if I can get this to the point where it'll focus. There we go. Radical new insight into the nature of quantum reality. Suggests parallel universes might not exist. So we've had enough talks together now over the years. You're aware of some of the paradoxes and conundrums in quantum mechanics and various answers people have devised in order to at least rationalize or at least make progress towards understanding what's really going on. The multiverse idea, I think probably the quickest way I can remind you about that and sketch it out is if you think back to the setup of the picture of the Schrodinger's cat situation, right? So the Schrodinger cat situation that illustrates one of the nubs of difficulty in interpreting quantum mechanics is you've got a chamber with a cat in there, and you've got an ampule of with a radioactive particle in it that you know has a half-life of a certain amount of time. Let's say give it a couple minutes. That means that after a couple minutes there's a 50-50 chance that this particle has decayed and spit off a gamma ray, a signal of radioactive decay. That's all really easy physics to arrange. And then you've got a detector that would read that gamma ray when it comes off and trip another couple things to happen that would cause a vial of cyanide to break and be very bad for the cat. Well, you can therefore look at that sequence of events in that experimental situation, and there's a certain point in time where you could say there's a 50-50 chance of this cat being alive or dead. Well, in truth, this radioactive particle is never going to decay at exactly that half-life. The half-life is arrived at by statistical measurements on other examples of the same system done over a period of time. If you fast forward to the period of one half-life, somebody's standing there outside the box looking into it, but without opening it. The, the wave formulation of quantum mechanics, Schrodinger's wave mechanical mathematical formulation of QM would say that this particle for sure is in a state of superposition. We don't know if it's decayed or not. It's in a weird quantum state where it's 50-50, decayed and not decayed. And since everything else in this apparatus is a causal chain with no wiggle room, that would imply that the cat also is 50% alive and 50% dead, which is ridiculous, right? And that's why Schrodinger came up with this paradox. He was essentially making a critique of his own mathematical structure of quantum mechanics. He was saying, my best way of describing reality that I've been able to come up with, and all you other scientists around me seem to like it, and you're finding ways to apply it, and it's turning out to be incredibly fruitful. But nonetheless, it still says we can have 50% alive and 50% dead cats. Well, it seems like we still have some work to do. So it was very sophisticated thing he was bringing up at that moment, and sort of in the true spirit of being a good scientist, which is, of course, you want your theories to work, and you really hope they're going to describe reality, but you stay completely alert to the ways in which they don't. Well, that's what the Schrodinger's cat paradox came that way. Well, there's different ways to approach this. There's a bunch of theories have come up. We've talked about them before. One of them is the so-called many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which says when the universe comes to a fork in the road, take it. In other words, if you open this box to look, the reason you don't see a 50-50 alive dead cat doesn't have to be explained in terms of this mystical thing called quantum wave function collapse, which is the way standard quantum mechanics would try to couch it. But instead, what happened somewhere along that chain is the universe split into two, and there's one universe that has a copy of you in it seeing a dead cat, and another universe that has a copy of you seeing an alive cat. And that splitting of universes ends up solving lots of problems. It does away with the otherwise very thorny issue that we call wave function collapse, of which there is much written and a lot of debate, but no resolution at this point. It's to just this is all tangled up in a thing you've heard me mention called the measurement problem. Well, now in a series of a couple articles here, I'm reading two new approaches, one theoretical and one experimental, suggesting ways out of needing the many worlds interpretation. And so if these pan out, this is a kind of a good thing. We'll see where it goes. It's still tentative. But if it pans out, we're going to be in a position to constrain our thinking and maybe not have to consider the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So the first one, this one from January 11th, is a theoretical paper where what these workers have done is they've and science often progresses this way. You come up with the idea of a simplified system, and then you start applying your equations onto it and trying to see new angles and think about new approaches and see if it leads your thinking in a direction that is novel and insightful with some broad implications. And that's what these fellows did. They there are a couple guys named Sandu Popescu and Daniel Collins at the University in Bristol, the UK, were the chief authors in this piece of work being described here. And they came up with a way of looking at the measurement problem and sorting it out. Instead of using time energy operators, they were analyzing it in terms of momentum and conservation of momentum. And what they realized, if they just looked at it all from a slightly different angle than is typically done, is that they could infer a crucial role for the preparing apparatus. So any measurement sequence, we have a measurement apparatus. Well, and usually upstream of that was some kind of macroscopic preparation apparatus, and then there's an observer at the other end that's somehow seeing and interpreting whatever the measurement apparatus does. Well, these fellows came up with a particularly important role for the so-called preparation apparatus. In their case, this had to do with a certain kind of a laser system that is going to prepare a small collection of very small magnets in certain quantum states, and then let those evolve in time and see what happens to the quantum states of these magnets, particularly with regards to the question of conservation of momentum, which is one of the central tenets of physics. And that's about as far as I'm going to go into it. It's kind of it's a long article. I've read it 2.5 times now. Lots of underlining and questions to myself. I'm going to have to wait till another couple of articles come out on this and I'll dig around and find their original papers. I'm interested enough that I probably will do that. I may be able to give a better and more informative description of their model if I loop back to this in 6 months. But the long story short of it is that what they came up with is a pretty well-constructed theoretical argument that a more full accounting of preparation, time evolution, measurement apparatus, observation, particularly carried out in a momentum space, mitigates against the need for a many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. So that's huge. It takes me a long time to say that sort of vague sentence, but it's nonetheless a big deal in the context of modern physics. So there's going to be a lot of people checking their work and trying to come up with actual experimental embodiments to test it. And then on the topic of experimental embodiments, there came along another article having bearing on this very same topic, and this was in the New Scientist May 31st issue, and they came up with this interesting title. And this one actually is a little more dear to my heart in a way because it's an experimental study, and I'm an experimentalist, and I like experiments. They tend to talk louder to me than highly intricate theoretical arguments. And so these folks have essentially conducted a very highly refined form of the double slit experiment using photons. The double slit experiment, we've talked about it enough times in here, and you've seen the pictures of how if we have two slits and we allow a wave front of photons or electrons or any other quantum particles to impinge upon two slits, which then moves forward and hits at an array of detectors like a film plane or a CCD strip, that is going to tell you where do the hits happen. Uh, in that classical, let's go with the photon version, you can turn the intensity of the light down to the point where there's only one photon at a time going into your apparatus and hitting these two slits, but you still see the interference pattern on the other side where it hits the detector or the film strip. In other words, what what it looks like in the quantum mechanical interpretation is that this photon somehow splits into two and goes through both of the slits, each of which now acts like a point source of wave function. And the wave function, according to its mathematics, interferes with itself and arrives at the screen in the form of an interference pattern instead of just two images of a slit, which would be what you'd get if the photon just went straight through the right one or straight through the left one. And so what it means is the quantum particle, in this case a photon, goes both ways at once. That implies a physical delocalization of something. And standard quantum mechanics would say, well, yeah, it's delocalization of the wave function because the wave function exists over a broad region of space hitting the slits. It's no huge mystery that it could go through both of them. Well, it is kind of a huge mystery. You still have to let go of common sense thinking. You have to be willing to think partway into the quantum realm and just get used to how weird things are. Then it doesn't sound so weird. But what he did was construct a more sophisticated apparatus using beam splitters and polarizers that allowed him to make something called a weak measurement. In other words, an attempt to find what we call which way information. So imagine the double slit experiment where you have a way to tell which slit the photon went through, but without stopping it and still allowing it to roll forward and hit the film plane. This is controversial. It's going to be controversial. He claims to have backed out of this using weak polarizers, an interpretation for his experiment that says there really is something tangible going through both slits. And it's tangible to the extent to which you believe in the idea of a weak detector. I'm not sure I do. I'm kind of skeptical on this, but it strikes me that we would have both a major piece of work in the theoretical approach, and then soon on its heels, a completely different approach in the experimental realm, both of which say we may not have to resort to this many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, even though it does seem to solve some problems that attend paradoxes and puzzles in the standard formulation of quantum mechanics. We may have a way out of that, but theoretically, and we now have what could turn out to be robust and reproducible experimental evidence that in fact the wave function is a thing and it can delocalize in space and penetrate multiple slits in a tangible way. It's not just a mathematical fantasy, or it's not just an informational concept and a way of keeping track of probabilities. It's more real than that. It's more real than just math. That grabs my ear. Interesting to me as an experimentalist. I sort of like things to be more real than just math. And so I will tell you about developments along those lines as time allows. And I realize now I'm at 40 minutes, and so my final pair of ideas I was going to talk about here has to do with cosmology and the idea of dark energy. Dark energy dark matter. Those are two kind of strange, non-intuitive ideas that are forced upon us by observational astronomy and then the science of cosmology as applied to those observations. Um, it would take me another 15 minutes to really do this one justice. So I think what I'm going to do is just kind of call it quits here and come back in a couple months, and we'll pick it up at this point of departure, and you'll learn about why it looks like dark energy may not be a constant of the universe. There's something going on with dark energy to make us think that it is changing over time in a very interesting way. It has some big implications. So I hope you're all doing well and that you have a great week ahead. And it was nice to be with you again. Good night. Jeff out.